I'm Paul Aron. I am the author of the forthcoming book, The Lineup, which is about the most influential books in history, in baseball history, books that changed the nature of the game. And I am here with Chris Lamb, the author of Stolen Dreams, which is the topic of today's pandemic baseball book club discussion. Hello, Chris.
Hi, Paul. Nice to see you.
Let me hold up the book, which
There
is
it
a
goes.
wonderful
Yeah.
book. I highly recommend it. Chris, one of the things that I often am annoyed by is when I hear a book described as a baseball book, described as more than a baseball book, because it somehow suggests that baseball is not in and of itself a good subject for a book. And of course, baseball is a wonderful subject for many books. But in the case of your book, I think one really does have to say this is more than a baseball book. It really is a book about, well, it's about the civil rights movement. It's about racism and the history of race in Charleston. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I should probably start by asking you to tell us a little bit about what the book is about.
Well, the book is about the 11 and 12-year-olds in the first Black Little League in South Carolina, and they represented the Cannon Street YMCA, and the president of the Cannon Street Y, which was a very influential YMCA in the Black neighborhoods on the Charleston Peninsula, and he wanted to find a way to challenge segregation, because he knew if we can get Little League baseball integrated, then we can get the parks integrated, we can get the schools integrated, we can get the theaters integrated. And so that's what he wanted to do. And so he created this Little League team. And Little League baseball was integrated by their rules. Their rules prohibited racism. Their rules prohibited segregation. And if you signed up for it, and if you signed up for a team, you had to sign your name to that form that said that you were going to abide by Little League baseball's rules. So the team starts, the Black team plays it's a Black league, and the All-Stars are picked as they are in every other Little League in the country. And there were thousands of teams at that point, at least. And once they signed up that team into a district tournament at the end of the season in Charleston, all hell broke loose, because this was right after the Brown versus Board of Education signed. This is in the middle of segregation in the state where where most of the slaves in the country came, where the Civil War started, and they were not going to have any part of integration in any way. We can't let integration happen. We can't let even Black kids play white kids in the great game of baseball. And so the white team said they boycotted it. They boycotted the tournament. And the the Cannon Street All-Stars, were told by the managers, you can go, we can play as long as you can, as long as you keep winning, we're going to go all the way to the Williamsport, the Little League Baseball World Series. So the white teams pull out, the Black team advances to the state tournament, where the same thing happens. White teams
by forfeit.
By forfeit. They go to forfeit. And this time there was more at stake. And the white politicians are rattling their cages and flying the Confederate flag, and this can't happen. And at this point, the head of Little League Baseball, a white guy in South Carolina, he says that, okay, we're all going to pull out. All the white teams are going to pull out of the state tournament, and this guy is going to create his own segregated league, because Little League Baseball tells them you have to play the Cannon Street All-Stars. So they all pull out. Cannon Street team wins by forfeit again, and they go to the regional tournament. If they win the regional tournament, they get to the promised land, and these 11 and 12-year-olds, this is what every little league baseball player, black or white, dreams of, going to Williamsport and playing on that great field. And now they're only one tournament away. And they go to Rome, Georgia, near Atlanta, there's a lot of clients. This is Brown versus Board of Education was like hitting a wasp nest full of Klansmen. And they all just blew up, and they all went all over the South. And the Cannon Street.
It sounds sort of ironic that Brown really made it harder for this team.
Exactly, and that's the point here.
The backlash from Brown, at least, or the fear
is before Brown. White supremacists stood outside schools and says the blacks cannot enter the school. White supremacists stood inside the white lines of a baseball field and said blacks cannot cross this white line. And so they go to Rome, Georgia, and the director of the tournament there told the black team, told the Cannon Street All-Stars, you're ineligible because Little League Baseball's rules say you have to play on the field and you have to win on the field to get here, and you won on forfeit. And they protest to the home office, the national organization office in Williamsport, and the president of Little League Baseball says, well, that's our rules. Sorry. And that's the end of the season. And now it's the end of the season, but this is kind of now where the story becomes a national story.
And the team did end up going to
Yes.
the Little League World Series. Can you talk about how they ended up going, and a little bit about? I was struck by some of the scenes in your book along the way to the World Series. I mean, one has read about what black teams and what Negro League teams, what blacks on minor league teams went through in the South, but one couldn't imagine that happening to 12-year-olds.
And that's really the point of the book, Paul, is that we're not dealing with adults. We're dealing with 11 and 12-year-olds. And that somehow makes the story a lot more crueler in the national newspapers, because we didn't have cable news. We didn't have any of that stuff. We just had newspapers and magazines and radio and television a little bit. And so what happened is before, in the South at this time and before, Southern newspapers had rules that the only time if you were black that you would appear in the newspaper would be if you were arrested, or as some newspapers did, if you were hanging from a tree. It's a little different on the sports page, because sports page was ahead of America at that point, because black athletes were, if you're on the sports page in this meritocracy we call sports, and then it was okay to have a black person on the sports section or in the newspaper. But in this, American newspapers, with the idea of racism made us uncomfortable, whether we were white or whether we were liberal or whether we lived in the North. We did not want to talk about this, and newspapers didn't. But now comes along these 11 and 12-year-olds, these 11 and 12-year-old boys who just wanted to play baseball, and it's that simple. And newspapers, for the first time, or in a rare, a number of newspapers and editorials came out and said, this is really lousy. And they lashed onto the Southern bigots who kept the black kids from playing. And Dick Young, who was then this giant in the New York Daily News, lashes out not only at the bigots that kept the black kids from playing, but at Little League Baseball. And he interviews Jackie Robinson. And so Little League Baseball starts to think, oh, this is really too bad.
Speaking of, while you're talking about newspapers, two of the most interesting figures in the book, I thought, one of them was a newspaper man, and I found fascinating the connections you drew between the Watlings, the judge, and the editor. Can you talk a little about them? and their
Yeah.
role in this story?
Oh yeah, you have this. You have Tom Waring, who was part of who's the editor of this, and he's this white supremacist, and he's basically he's Fox News. Before Fox News, he's Tucker Carlson, and he's this absolute racist, and he doesn't want to have any discussions of race, and his father's favorite brother was a guy named Jay Waring, who was a federal judge who had been part of the conservative establishment until he became a federal judge, and he got closer to it, and he saw all the racists in his courtroom, and then he divorces his wife, this socialite Charleston woman, and marries this twice divorced New Yorker, and she starts telling him about racism, and now Waring's is paying attention to racism, and he's voting against the South. He's voting against, he's encouraging Thurgood Marshall. In fact, in the case that was 3 years before Brown versus Board of Education, that was Elliott versus Brigg, which was a school segregation case. Waring calls Thurgood Marshall into his office and tells Thurgood Marshall, you need to be more aggressive in challenging school segregation. And Marshall says, no, I'm not, I can't win this case. And Waring says, you have to. And sure enough, it goes to the district case. Waring's the judge votes and he dissents, and his dissent then comes back to life with Thurgood Marshall arguing in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. But there is this wonderful dynamic between members of the same family, one representing the traditional white supremacist, conservative views, and the other is this creature from another planet who was pushing racial equality in his culture.
After a remarkable transformation in his own opinion. I mean, he didn't start off as some civil rights figure. On the contrary, and I found his transformation fascinating. I mean, similarly, I'm interrupting your story, so I apologize. But I mean, similarly, I found Morrison's transformation fascinating. Can you talk a little about his role?
Yeah, and I'm not sure if Robert Morrison and Jay Waring ever met. They probably did, but Robert Morrison grows up. He's born in 1884, so he grows up in segregated Charleston, and he sort of understands as an educated Black man that I can only do so much. That I'm going to accept. I'm an accommodationist. I want to do what I can as a Black person for Black people. But I know if I push too hard, I can end up hanging from a tree. And so,
the Booker T. Washington approach.
Exactly. Yeah, he's a Booker T. Washington as opposed to the W.E.B. Du Bois. And as he gets older, and just like with Waring doesn't have his awakening until he's 60. And the same is true for Robert Morrison. After World War II, when it becomes clear that Black soldiers have gone over and fought and died just like white soldiers, and they come back and they're lynched in their uniforms by white supremacists who don't feel that Black soldiers are allowed to have equal rights, having many died and others injured, and they're treated so horribly. And Morrison starts to come around, and that's the transformation of Robert Morrison.
Well, because there are so many fascinating characters in this book, I sidetracked you, and I apologize because you were you got away from they all have to do with the story of the team and the kids. But I interrupted your tale of the kids themselves. They did get ultimately to the World Series. I found one of the scenes that I was just very moved by was, I think you said you had written that they had been promised by some of the adult coaches that they would be met with a parade and fire trucks, and they were in fact met by fire trucks, but in a very different way. Can you describe that? Because I found that scene very moving.
That's the loveliness of Robert Morrison. Is Robert Morrison, instead of saying, okay, they've shot us down in Georgia, that's the end of it, guys, let's just end here and I'm sorry. He realizes, he's smart enough to realize that if it ends here, the story goes away. Let's keep us, even though this is going to be embarrassing, even though we're going up and we're going to watch white kids live out our dreams, Robert Morrison says, we're going to stay in the newspapers longer if we do this. So Robert Morrison gathers the kids together and tells the kids we're going to go up there, and the parents don't quite understand it, because the coaches are told the players they're not going to play, but the players are 11 and 12-year-olds. They don't understand this. They think they're going to play. And one of the best players, his father says, you're not going. This is just nuts. You're not going. So he doesn't go.
And dangerous.
Right. It's dangerous, of course. And they can't stop. They can't stop anywhere. They're going through Klan country, through South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. But Morrison tries to keep, and the kids are so upbeat all the way up there. And Morrison's saying, you're going to be greeted by fire trucks and bands, and the car breaks down outside of Williamsport. And they come and the fire trucks come and get them, and the tow truck drags the bus into town, and that bus probably had 800,000 miles on it anyway, and it had broken down a number of times. But this bus was used by S.L. Jenkins to take Black adults to register to vote in that bus. And so sure enough, it's met with fire trucks, and they show up. It takes them 24 hours to get from Charleston to Williamsport. And there they are, and they go in, and Little League Baseball, to their credit, treats them at least cosmetically as equals. They are allowed, they get all the freebies that the players in the tournament get. They get the T-shirts, they get this wonderful meal, and at breakfast they sit by themselves, and people from Little League Baseball says, no, you're going to sit with the players. We're all going to sit together.
Some of the kids still think they're going to play, right?
Oh yeah, I think it's the fantasy of being 11. Why would somebody drag us all the way up here if we're not going to play? Now, I'm not sure if any of them brought their clubs. I'm sure they didn't bring their uniforms. I know that for a fact. But they're 11 and 12. They're so fragile, and they get up there, and sure enough, that they watch the game, the first game. It's the finals, and then sort of the game between the concession game between third and fourth place teams, and they're introduced, and the players will tell the story that they're introduced, and because this was a big story. Everybody knew this team. This was the best known team in the tournament, even though they weren't playing. And the fans, according to the players, say, let them play, and let them play. And hundreds of fans are saying, let them play, let them play. And the fans and the players hear this, and the players stick out their chest a little further, and then they're taken off the field, and they sit down, and then they realize they're not going to play. And they're going to play, and they're going to watch. As it turns out, one of the teams in the finals was an integrated team, and they watched this integrated team. They watched these black players playing, and they watched the white players playing, and they're just devastated. The cover photo looks at them, and they're staring at the camera. Right, they're staring at the camera.
These are not smiling kids.
Nobody. I mean, a photo is being taken, and you've got 15 kids, and maybe one of them is smiling. And it's just heartbreaking. And then when it's all over, it's a terrific game. And then the next day or so, they get back on the bus, and they're 90-year-old men. These 11 and 12-year-old kids, their hearts are broken, and they get in. And on their way back to Charleston is when Emmett Till is murdered and lynched. in Money, Mississippi. Now, they don't know it at the time, but they find out soon afterwards.
You know, one of the remarkable things about the way you wrote this book is, at least for me as a reader, I got so caught up in the kid's story that when the fans, at least some of the fans, as you said, were screaming, let them play, even though I knew, you can read the flap copy of the book and you know they are not going to end up playing. This is not going to have a happy ending. But I got caught up in, oh, maybe. Yeah. And, you know, it was devastating for me as reader when they didn't play. One can only begin to imagine how devastating it was for the kids. You talked to some of the kids as adults. Did they, what was your sense of how, not just how they reacted at the time, which you've talked about, but how this impacted them over the years?
I think what happens when you grow up Black at that time and maybe Black now, I don't know, is you sort of, your soul is scarred and your expectations are curbed. Now, John Rivers, who's my favorite character in the book, who became a very successful architect, and he now lives in Ecuador. Now, he was able to escape it, and he said he only escaped it because he moved to New York. He moved to Virginia. He went to Hampton Institute to go to college, and then he became an architect in New York. And, you know, but he tells the story that his father was in Korea during this time in the army, and his father heard about the story. It was covered by the Associated Press. But, you know, but John also says, when I ask him about the fans yelling, you know, let them play, and John says, I can hear those fans to this day. But I think with a lot of players, it buried them. I just don't think, being 11 and 12 is such an important age. Of course, they're all important ages, but if we you know, if you find out at age 11 that no matter how good you are, you'll never be good enough to be the least talented white kid. It's a horrible education, and you couldn't play high school baseball. The Black school didn't have baseball, didn't have sports, so your options were pretty much the army.
The story, you talked about all the coverage that the story got back then. It was a big story then, but at least it got forgotten after then. I mean, until your book, I had not heard of this story at all. Tell me how after it was forgotten, you came upon it and came to research and write this story.
That is where Gus Holt comes into the story. And Gus Holt he's kind of the protagonist, even though he's not one of the players. He's a couple years younger than the players. His dad's in the army. He's living in Hawaii while this is going on. He comes back. Nobody knows anything about it. And 40 years happen. And Gus Holt becomes a race man in the meantime. He becomes a race man. He becomes involved in civil rights, and he has a son, and he teaches that son to fight for what you believe in. And so Lawrence, you know, Gus is coaching Lawrence in Little League Baseball, or in Dixie League Baseball, which is now, which at one time was segregated, but by the 1990s it's integrated. That replaced Little League Baseball in the South. And so Lawrence makes the All-Star team, and he comes to see his father. And his father, I mean, Gus Holt I'd miss him. Gus Holt died about a year and a half ago, and he was just this incredibly charismatic, excitable guy. And I can see him telling the story. He says, Lawrence walks into the living room to show me the uniform, and all I can see is a Confederate flag on Lawrence's uniform. And Gus becomes like that cartoon character whose head blows up. And he wants to know how this Confederate flag ended up on his Black son's uniform. And so he starts investigating it. And he, first of all, he goes to the mayor and said, what the heck is going on here? And the mayor was Joe Riley, who was a pretty liberal mayor. And Riley tells him that, I don't know what you're talking about. There are no Confederate flags on a uniform. And then Gus takes out a photo and shows it to him. And Joe Riley supports Gus at the city council meeting. And so Gus starts wondering what happened. So he starts talking to people and he starts investigating, and he finds out the story of the 1955 Cannon Street All-Stars, that whose hopes and dreams were snuffed out by racists. And then they brought in this segregated league to take the place. And so Gus,
sort of like private schools replaced public schools after Brown.
Exactly. And he begins calling up people on the Cannon, of cold calling. He didn't know any of these people. I guess he bumped into one at a high school reunion, and he said, were you on that team? And the guy says, yes, I was on that team. And the guy, as he was talking at the reunion, he started tearing up, thinking about what happened to him in 1955. And he tells the story, we were supposed to play. We were gonna play, and they wouldn't let us play at the Little League World Series. So Gus starts calling people. He tracks down John Rivers, and John Rivers kind of says, I mean, who are you? What do you want? Because it's 40 years. And so then Gus Holt decides he wants to bring back Little League Baseball to Charleston. So he takes on this reunion, bringing back the Cannon Street All-Stars. He wants to bring back Little League Baseball. And then he finds out that Lawrence has brain cancer. So he's got these three things that are going on, and he just keeps trying to work through all of it. But he is just this guy that is as smart as anybody I've ever met, and as hardworking as anybody I've ever met.
He certainly connected you to a lot of this story, but there's so much Charleston history here. You must have had some additional connections to Charleston.
Yeah, I spent 15 years as a journalism professor at the College of Charleston, but I knew some of this. I walked past Mother Emanuel Church on my way to work, and I was living in Indiana, where the 9 parishioners were murdered in just the worst way you could be murdered. And I knew a lot about students. I had enough Black students in College of Charleston, and there weren't that many, who were telling me about the racism they faced, and how I had one of the students who was just this terrific guy telling me that when he came for freshman orientation, a Black police officer on the campus said, you're going to get arrested while you're here. And my student thought that he didn't quite process it until he realized it was a warning and not a threat.
Not a threat.
Right, that you're going to be arrested because you are a Black man in Charleston, South Carolina. So yes, I knew some of it beforehand, but once you start, pulling the string on your shirt and the shirt starts coming apart is how you find out more, and you get.
I mean, it just seemed to be so many different connections to that you found between racism and baseball, even starting. I mean, I think you opened with the riot from, I can't remember the year.
There was a baseball riot in 1869.
Yeah. I mean, baseball and race and Charleston seemed intertwined in ways that, as a writer, you couldn't make them up. You found all these strings, but you somehow managed.
You can't separate race in Charleston in any way at any time and anyhow, because what the city owes its wealth and its story to slavery, and half of all African Americans in the United States can trace their roots to slavery, and it hasn't. I mean, Charleston is this absolutely beautiful city, and it's part of that city is really trying to come to some sort of acknowledgement of its past. Part of that city is really trying, and but everything in that city, every building, every street was built pretty much by slave labor.
When going into this book, I knew very little about the history of race in Charleston, or the connection between racism and baseball in Charleston. If you'd asked me before reading this book what Charleston had to do with baseball, I would have, the only story I would have been able to come up with was the Doubleday story.
Okay.
That of course, we Doubleday, of course, did not invent baseball, despite the tales of stories of that. But he did, in fact, it is correct that he did fire the first shot of at least the first Union shot of the Civil War. That is correct, right?
And he was hated in Charleston for doing that. And if he had ever been captured, bad things would have happened. But he was also at Gettysburg. He was he was then, I believe, a brigadier general at Gettysburg, and he had and he had obviously done well at Gettysburg.
Well, he was the perfect hero to invent baseball. This book, unfortunately, doesn't have a perfect hero who can, has many heroes, but no one who can prevail, at least at the time.
Yeah, this is where we go back to your interest in writing about these books of baseball and fiction, and in the movie The Natural, and the book The Natural. And I love the book The Natural. It's one of my favorite novels.
Very different movie.
Very different.
But how one treats heroes is always a part of the baseball story, or baseball stories. What ended up happening with I don't think you finished the story, telling the story of the Dixie League and the flag on the uniforms, and what happened to the Dixie League after Gus Holt got involved. Well,
or even eventually after Gus Holt got involved, he went to city council and he raised hell, and Mayor Riley supported him, and Mayor Riley basically says, you can either take that Confederate flag off these uniforms, and if you don't, then we're not going to support a Dixie League baseball anymore. And so they took the Confederate flag off the uniforms at that point.
Does the league still exist?
Yes.
And it's still called Dixie?
It's called Dixie Youth Baseball. Yeah, I wrote a piece about it for the Nation magazine recently, about how the start of the season, and they don't acknowledge their past,
but the name sort of acknowledges.
It does. Yes.
But they don't. It's not a complete denial of the past.
But they don't have the Confederate flag on their uniforms on their rule books anymore. So yes.
Progress of sort.
Yeah, but you're right. Having Dixie in the title is you're not hiding.
Well, clearly the story of baseball integration. Again, back to heroes. We like, Jackie Robinson was, of course, a great hero, and we like to believe that as a result of his heroism, integration came and swept through the world of baseball and the rest of the world. But I think Stolen Dreams certainly complicates that story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, right. And, Jackie Robinson made a difference, but the people who want to believe that, who tell,
after that everything was great.
Yeah, who tell Black people or tell liberal or progressive white people, I mean, what do you want now? But the Stolen Dreams, I think, reduces it, or not, doesn't reduce it, but looks at kids. And we really want to protect our kids. We want our kids to get to a certain point, maybe when they understand that their dreams don't always come true. But when you're 11 and 12 years old, you want to be able to believe in your dreams.
it is a heartbreaking story, and I can only highly recommend to everyone Stolen Dreams by Chris Lamb. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Paul.